Hello and welcome to Syria Talks, the show exploring the intricacies of the Syria crisis. I'm your host, Danny Mackey. The US finds itself in a tough foreign policy predicament, with considerable parts of Iraq and Syria overrun by the terror group ISIS. The regional ambitions of this group and the scale of their atrocities have made the jihadi organisation the main US foreign policy priority. Although the war on ISIS had gained more momentum of late in Iraq, the same cannot be said for Syria, where ISIS seems to be building a more solid foundation. Today, the main victims of ISIS terrorism are Syrians on all sides of the political divide, with the US assessment of the ISIS threat being medium to longer term, the future looks increasingly bleak for Syria. This comes as the infamous leader of the Islamic State, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, was reportedly seriously injured in an airstrike. Today we discuss what can be done to combat and ultimately degrade ISIS. We are joined by Mujtaba Ali Masood, a research analyst and documentary producer, and Max Abrams, a terrorist expert and professor of political science at Northwestern University, who joins us from Boston. But before we begin, let's take a quick look at this video report on the ISIS threat emanating from Syria.
As terrorism extends from the raging battlefields of Syria to the heart of the Western world, now more than ever, the conflict in Syria is under the spotlight. Recent attacks in Paris and Copenhagen have raised significant questions over returning Western jihadists from Syria, with the importance of quelling extremism and ISIS growing on a day-to-day basis. The number of Europeans fighting with jihadist groups in Syria could well exceed 6,000, according to a top EU official. Vera Jourova, the EU Justice Commissioner, stated that at least at the European level we estimate that 5,000 to 6,000 individuals have left for Syria, adding that the true number was likely to be far higher due to the difficulty of tracking foreign fighters in the conflict. Whilst a year after ISIS became a household name in the United States, using brutality and savvy propaganda to challenge Al-Qaeda and its affiliates for jihadist adherents, US persecutions of would-be recruits have exploded. Law enforcement officials said at least 25 people have been detained since January. ISIS has benefited from a media environment that amplifies its propaganda. The group quickly reached early recruits through videos that showcased the fear its adherents instilled in non-believers. In Minnesota, 9 men have been charged as part of an alleged cell of recruits linked to an American Abdi Noor, who turned up fighting with ISIS in Syria in 2014 and began to appeal to his friends to come to the Middle East. A senior United States counterterrorism official said, "Each one of those folks who makes it over there has the capability to reach out back to their contacts back here on American soil." Meanwhile, in Europe, ISIS has attempted to smuggle jihadists into mainland Europe disguised as desperate refugees, according to NATO, which proves that the group is taking advantage of the dire humanitarian situation in North Africa.
Mujtaba, if we could just start with you. How do you see the ISIS threat from Syria today? How real is it?
Well, the ISIS threat has increased recently when we look at Syria and when we look at its dominance in Iraq right now. Furthermore, we have the situation in Libya, the external situation in Nigeria at the moment. So we're starting to see the influence of ISIS increasing, and it's becoming a threat to homeland security everywhere. And it all goes back down to whether we were able to stop the rise of ISIS. How much did the countries surrounding Syria play a part?
How is this, this threat, what shape does it take?
Well, it's an ideological threat. I mean, we know that the roots of ISIS is an ideology of takfirism, a Salafi ideology. And unfortunately, there are countries neighboring around Syria that overlooked that. And now that they see that the threat is coming back to them, all of a sudden they want to implement changes. But the rise of ISIS, unfortunately, was the fault of countries globally in not combating it in the first place.
If we could just take this to Max Abrams, do you think the US has been successful in attempting to degrade ISIS?
Well, I agree with your other guest who's alluding to, I think, the US role, in fact, in the creation of Islamic State. And there's really no doubt that the US did inadvertently contribute to this problem by, of course, taking out Saddam Hussein, which created space in that country for al-Qaeda in Iraq, which has transformed into ISIS. And now the U.S. is doing really everything it can to degrade this group. How successful are we? Well, I think we have mixed success. I mean, the biggest problem is that it's a basic truism that counterinsurgency success really depends on having boots on the ground. And after the debacles of the George W. Bush administration, Americans are understandably reluctant to deploy our own ground forces. And
could you describe U.S. policy as limited to an extent?
Oh, it's very much limited. I mean, we're completely hamstrung. First, Americans have a bad taste in their mouth when they think about deploying troops in Afghanistan and in Iraq. That really didn't work out very well. Even before that, Americans, the older ones, may think about the Vietnam War and how intractable that conflict was, and ultimately not worth it given the costs. And furthermore, it should be pointed out the obvious, which is that Islamic State has not, had a big attack against the U.S. homeland in the same way that al-Qaeda did on 9/11. I think that if ISIS were to really have a mass casualty attack against a soft target in the U.S., then support for ground forces would, of course, grow. But given the Bush legacy and the relative safety of the American public from terrorism, there isn't that, taste for ground troops. And that's a huge impediment in terms of taking on Islamic State, because, again, counterinsurgency success hinges on troops. And so we're reliant. We're successful really only where ground troops exist, and there aren't that many places where we've used them effectively in combination with air power. An example of a success, I think, is in Kobani, where the Kurds were on the ground and the Americans provided air support. And together, that 1-2 combination seems successful. The same sort of dynamic we saw in Tikrit, where it wasn't the Kurds on the ground there, it was the Shia militia. And with the Shia militia and American air power, that was successful. But
Max, would you think that the Kurdish groups, especially the YPG, would they be better allies for the United States than some of the other different rebel groupings in the north of Syria now?
I do think so. I do think so, and I think that Americans are actually surprisingly, pro-Kurd. There's a sense that we can work with these people, that they are not going to defect to, radical Sunni groups, and that they're very much on our side and trustworthy. I also think that I've been in favor of increasing military support to the Kurds, because I think that they've demonstrated how helpful they can be to us.
Now, would a ceasefire in Syria benefit the war on ISIS?
I just don't think that it's practical. I'm not really sure how that would happen. I would be in favor of that, but I don't really see that in the cards.
Okay, if we could take this to you, Mojtaba. The US seems to still regard President Assad as the enemy. In your opinion, who is the enemy of the United States of America today?
Well, let's put it simply. The threat to homeland security in America are these Salafi radical groups. You won't see any pro-Syrian government or pro-Assad committing a crime or a terrorist act in the United States. But as we know, this is a geopolitical issue, and therefore they will have to play the game as the GCC or the countries neighboring would like them to. And unfortunately, they have, in a sense, strengthened the moderate groups, which we know indirectly supported ISIS, because eventually a lot of them deserted to ISIS, or they eventually lost battles with opposition groups.
But the fact that the US is now in a form of kind of an unspoken alliance with Iran in Iraq, would that affect the way the US perceives the Syria war?
Well, at the moment, it doesn't look like it. They have helped in Iraq, in Tikrit, not as much in Tikrit, to be honest with you, but they have pushed for airstrikes in Mosul. But we know that that was a threat to their interests in Kurdistan and specifically in Erbil. So at the moment, the situation is a bit confusing with the United States. They're supporting opposition groups in Syria, but supporting Iranian-backed government in Iraq.
Now, how do you actually consider that the United States could use military pressure against the Assad-led government?
At the moment, I think the pressure is not there, and therefore I don't think they will make an alliance with Assad, and I don't think they'll be, let's say, arming the moderate groups as they did before. At the moment, I think Obama does not want to get further involved, even though he does want Assad to go. He'd rather not do anything about it and just do what he's been doing for the past 3 years.
Okay. Max, back to you. The ISIS leader Baghdadi is reportedly no longer in day-to-day control of the terror group ISIS as he recovers from injuries. How strong is the group operationally?
I think the group is still operationally strong. I mean, these groups are very resilient. Certain kinds of groups are more resilient to drone strikes than others. Large groups are more resilient, and Islamist groups also seem particularly resilient. And so for those reasons, Islamic State is a poor candidate for leadership decapitation. In fact, we don't really even know what Baghdadi's doing. We don't know, how strong of an influence he has over the rank and file. And I think that really just goes to show that if we were to remove him, I think, it would still be business as usual. It's the drone campaign, I think, has been a bit of a disappointment. In theory, drones work great. The idea is that you take out the leader of these militant groups, that the leadership tends to have the highest quality of fighters, and that they're difficult to replace. And so that by taking out these high-value targets, we, attrit the capability of the group. And yet, we've used drones against, the Taliban.
In Yemen, of course.
Success. And these conflicts just seem to go on indefinitely. There's a big, drones have been really the cornerstone of U.S. counterterrorism strategy since 2008. And so in response to the growing prevalence and importance, many academics have empirically tested whether the drone campaign is or is not successful.
So is ISIS like a hydra, where it has lots of different branches and different operational, structural? Is it the type of group which can survive if the head is chopped off?
Oh, there's no question about that. I mean, bin Laden is gone and the group, keeps on going. I think that you're right. I mean, we can understand Al-Qaeda as a single group, or we could look at it as, discrete groups with different affiliates. But what's clear is that the drone campaign really isn't working. And again, I think that the reason why is because air power cannot be used in isolation. It's very helpful, but only in tandem with boots on the ground.
So what's the perspective in the US on the issue of returning jihadists? How many of them, as in US jihadists, are actually in Syria as we speak?
Well, I think that for a while, Americans were, breathing a sigh of relief. Those who follow this sort of thing look at the numbers, and clearly European countries and all sorts of other countries are providing, the lion's share of foreign jihadis. And the United States has been comparatively quiet in terms of the supply of these people. However, over the past 18 months, I think there have been 40 people arrested in connection with Islamic State. And so the number of thwarted attacks seems to be on the rise. And so I don't think we could get complacent. I do believe that it's really just a matter of time before there is, either a returning, jihadist attack or some kind of lone wolf ISIS-inspired attack. but I think that there will be an ISIS attack in the United States, and I'm frankly surprised it hasn't happened already.
Mustafa, what do you make of this? The American jihadists now returning from Syria, how much of a threat do they actually pose to US homeland security?
Well, I think they pose a serious threat, as they pose jihadists returning to the UK, for example. What they've been through in Syria and what they've seen and what they've committed, we've seen the torture that they go through, we've seen the beheadings, we've seen all this brainwashing of children and enslaving of women. So to have someone to go through that and then come back to their country, they pose a real threat.
Do you agree with Max when he states that drone strikes can be very effective?
The problem with drone strikes is that the criticism that they've had from the media and from politicians means that it's created a very negative perspective, and therefore it's to go for drones in these countries, you'll probably get a backlash from the media and so on. So it's difficult to implement drones in those areas.
Can I just chime in there?
Now, Max, going back to you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with your guest at all. I mean, one of the reasons why there's so much a lack of consensus, if you will, in terms of the efficacy of drones is that it's not entirely clear what constitutes a success. I mean, there's no question that drones alienate the local population. They turn that target country against the United States. And so in that sense, drones are counterproductive. In terms of taking out the leaders, drones are good at that. However, there's no guarantee that the replacement of these leaders will be any more moderate than the people we've taken out.
Because we could give you the example of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, where we've had this emergence of the jihadi group within Yemen, and the majority of their leaders have actually been killed by US drone strikes. So in the long term, is it sustainable as a military force against these new age jihadi groups?
Well, the thing is, because drones are relatively new technology, we've really only used them in high concentrations since 2008. It's particularly hard to say anything that's empirically grounded in terms of the long-term success of this strategy. Most studies that look at the efficacy of drones look at a very narrow window. In my studies, for example, I look 14 days after the drone strike. Does it reduce the amount of militant group violence or not? So I'm not sure about the long-term effects.
Okay, last question to you. How do you see the Syria conflict changing as we speak? Is there hope for peace?
I don't think that there's hope for peace. I think that, just to speak in very general terms, that there's no clear winner in Syria. ISIS is not getting weaker. The Assad regime is getting weaker, but not that fast. And I think that we just need to let this thing play out and see who will prevail.
Okay, Max Abrams, terrorism expert and professor of political science at Northeastern University, joined us from Boston. Thank you very much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Mustafa, if we could take this to you, how do you see the Syria crisis now? Is there hope for a solution?
I think in the short term it's going to be very difficult. We're looking at different rebel groups fighting each other. We've got ISIS, we've got Jabhat al-Nusra, and we've got the Syrian Army, National Defense Force, and groups like Hezbollah. At the moment, there is a bit of a stalemate. There are a few infighting near Idlib, and also we've seen rebel groups alienate Jabhat al-Nusra. And from the perspective we're looking at, in the short term, there doesn't look like to be any peace, but in the long term, there will be one of these groups will prevail.
Now, I want to ask you a question on al-Nusra Front, because they are the official Al-Qaeda branch in Syria. I mean, how deadly and potent are they? Would you put them in the same criteria as ISIS?
Now, unfortunately, when ISIS has come, Nusra has looked like the good guys, or the ones that are not as extreme, and some have even sided with them, like the rebel groups. However, we know what Al-Qaeda can do. We know what they've done globally: suicide attacks, sectarian massacres, genocide, and therefore they are as deadly as ISIS. And it's very difficult for us to, once we see one group which is more brutal, to join the other brutal group. Is not something that, it's not a competition, shall we say. Jabhat al-Nusra is as violent as ISIS, and we should not form any sort of alliance with them. Unfortunately, we have been seeing that.
Now, we raised this point earlier, but it's something I would like to ask you about. It has been reported that over 6,000 European jihadists are in Syria. I mean, what could these individuals do if they ever return to Europe?
Well, I think we've already seen clips of what they've done in Europe from before. This Takfiri Salafi ideology has committed crimes in the UK and elsewhere. So I think, as unfortunately, the first thing that needs to be done is to close the border in Turkey, which is allowing these fighters to go inside. We know that 3 young schoolgirls went to Turkey and were able to enter. So there needs to be some sort of national security to stop these fighters leaving and therefore stop these fighters entering, because they do pose a security threat. And we know that all politicians, all governments in the region know that.
Okay, stay with us. Now, let's get a different perspective on the matter. Joshua Blakeney, a geopolitical analyst, joins us from Calgary, Canada. Joshua, thanks for coming onto the show. Calgary has been a hotspot for jihadists travelling to Syria. Can you tell us more about this?
Certainly, and thanks for having me on the show.
You're welcome.
Personally, when I engage in this discussion, I reject the premise that these various ragtag terrorist groups and Western governments are bitter adversaries. I think we have no good reason to presuppose that. Rather, I view this terrorist phenomenon, whether it's cropping up on the streets of Damascus or on the streets of London or Ottawa, Canada, as being involved and interwoven with Western intelligence agencies. Of course, Turkey was just mentioned, and of course, rightly fingers have been pointed at Turkey in recent years for their facilitation of terrorism in Syria. But, you know, Turkey and Turkish media recently responded and said, look, this isn't just us who are doing this, that Western intelligence agencies are, in fact, recruiting terrorists. And the Turkish media claimed that a member of CSIS, Canada's intelligence agency, had been caught by the Turkish authorities recruiting British citizens to engage in the activities of ISIS. And so whenever terrorist incidents or so-called foiled terror plots happen here in Canada, an increasing number of skeptics, many of whom are prestigious scholars, are pointing the finger at the intelligence agency in Canada, CSIS, or at the authorities, and saying that, look, there's just, you know, cui bono, who benefits? Like you have CSIS and the Canadian authorities. The Canadian regime, of course, is increasingly viewed to be a de facto puppet regime of Israel in this country. Canada's prime minister prioritizes the national interests of Israel over those of Canada, that they benefit from this. You know, so for example, recently we had the highly questionable October 22nd shooting in Ottawa, on the very day that Canadian F-16s were going on sorties to drop bombs upon the people of Iraq.
So
and
would you suggest
ISIS-inspired
would you suggest that the two incidents were actually linked? Would you say the two incidents are actually linked? Okay, we'll take this to Mujtaba.
Yeah.
UK jihadists has made up a large number of the actual European fighters in Syria. Why have so many UK jihadists travelled in particular?
Well, we know that in this country there is a high level of this ideological mentality. There are the platforms which provides this sort of rhetoric, this hate preaching, this sort of ideology which is spoken freely in the streets. Now, unfortunately, when you have a scholar like Qaradawi, who has millions of followers, and declares compulsory jihad for all Muslims to go fight in Syria, that's what you're going to get. you're going to get a large amount of Muslims going to fight in Syria. The same as another scholar, Al-Uraifi, who also declared compulsory jihad, only recently having changed his mind because of the Saudi influence. However, he also declared jihad and also came to the UK and started, preaching this sort of hatred. Unfortunately, these youth become brainwashed, and that's why they go and fight in Syria. It's as simple as that.
So would you argue there is an ideological element behind this, something religious, something which goes back to them being disillusioned? I mean, what would be the primary reason to make a young British youth go to Syria?
The core problem of ISIS is, unfortunately, the big elephant in the room, which is the Salafi ideology. Now, if you're going to enslave women, if you're going to kill Yazidis, if you're going to destroy statues or shrines, this is all ideological. It's not because you've been marginalized. If you're going to be marginalized by a government, you're not going to go around persecuting Christians, for example. What have they done to you? It's an ideological problem, and it needs to stop.
So what can actually be done to stop them?
Well, one of the main factors is this brainwashing that's taking place. And this brainwashing, or this platform that gives this brainwashing life, happens in centers, happens in mosques, happens in various social media, the internet. And unfortunately, this continuous brainwashing, this continuous rhetoric, this continuous us versus them, causes this sort of hatred, especially with youth who haven't got any jobs, or youth who are have flaws in their personality, can only be extreme in anything they do. Unfortunately, they will be brainwashed, and that is why they flee to Syria.
So could we actually argue that, because you were telling me before, I mean, you're a documentary producer by trade, and you were telling me an interesting story about one of the students of a very well-known Islamic preacher, who, incidentally, after you interviewed, went to Syria, did they not?
Yeah, and the funny thing is that this gentleman, Abu Rumaisa, was on bail for terrorist charges. Now, to tell me that this person was able to leave the country and go to Syria is, without the intelligence knowing, is simply unfound. They, in my opinion, knew he was going, and what they thought was good riddance. They would want these kind of people to leave their country and go fight in Syria. But unfortunately, we are seeing this daily. People fleeing to Syria, people fleeing even to North Africa in certain circumstances, like before, in other wars. And unfortunately, this platform exists in this country. They've been given this platform. They've abused the idea of free speech and inherited this hatred ideological views.
Now, if we could just take this to Joshua, who's been reconnected from Canada. How many Canadians are actually fighting in Syria, Joshua?
Yeah, the estimates vary, but if I can just quickly develop the point I was making, I think the point is that I reject the premise that this is an organic phenomenon that is occurring. And so, obviously I'm a Canadian citizen. I've been Press TV's Canadian correspondent. And so there's two manifestations of this terrorist phenomenon. One is in the Middle East, where, ISIS-inspired militants are destabilizing the Middle East, seemingly at the behest of regional powers who have a vested interest in regimes which don't consent to Israeli hegemony, for example, in the Middle East, being destabilized and weakened. But on the other hand, we see this manifesting here in Canada, where, obviously Israel's partisans are hegemonic in this country, in Canada and in France and in many Western countries. And whenever these so-called foiled terror plots occur or terrorist incidents occur in the West, straight away we have Orwellian pieces of legislation being enacted. For example, the Harper regime's legislative response to the highly controversial events in Ottawa was this Bill C-51, which is now making it illegal in Canada to disseminate what the authorities term terrorist propaganda. And of course, the Canadian authorities list any group which in any way opposes Israel in the Middle East as
Joshua,
terrorist.
what has the Canadian government done to stop jihadists going to Syria?
The thing is, they pay lip service to fighting ISIS, But as I say, recently it was revealed that in Turkey that a member of CSIS had been recruiting young British citizens to engage in the activities of ISIL. So, so a cardinal claim of terrorism skeptics is that this whole terrorist phenomenon is, there's more to it, that the intelligence agencies are actually facilitating this in order to enable Zionist goals in the Middle East and Zionist goals domestically.
Okay,
and then that's what we have.
If I could just get back to you on this, if we go to Mujtaba now, since the actual airstrikes on ISIS territories and fortifications began, has the war on ISIS actually developed or changed any significant part? I mean, are they now stronger or weaker?
Well, you could make an argument in Iraq that in certain areas the Iraqi army has been able to get back or make gains in that country. I'm not sure how much influence the airstrikes made. Rather, the Shia paramilitary forces and the tribal Sunni leaders and also the Peshmerga might have contributed more to that. In Syria, unfortunately, the anti-ISIS coalition and the US airstrikes haven't done much. And we can see actually ISIS haven't lost ground or haven't made any ground. Therefore, we can't really say that the airstrikes have kind of curbed the influence of ISIS in the region. And as Max mentioned earlier, you need to have ground troops to be able to dominate the areas that you're striking. So right now, at the moment, there doesn't seem to be any effect on ISIS by these airstrikes.
Joshua, where does the funding for them come from?
Well, obviously that's the $1 million question, isn't it? And obviously we don't have all the accounting books of the CIA and of the Israeli Mossad. But as I say, I'm a member of the burgeoning segment of society who contends that these terrorist groups are in fact being facilitated by Western intelligence agencies.
But could you not propose the argument that these groups are now self-funded, they're self-made, they're part of a vacuum which was created by Arab nationalism, which has now been left open, and these Islamist groups are essentially administering society as they should be. They have the historic right to do so, and they were purged by the nationalists and the communists. Do you not think there is a sense of rationale in such an opinion?
Well, there obviously is that ideological undercurrent, and maybe some of those people who are participating and being used as useful idiots in this destabilization doctrine genuinely believe in the cause that they're fighting for. But we know that Israel is a very important factor in this, and the Zionists are extremely adept at turning a negative into a positive. The Zionists have a problem of secular, Ba'athist, pan-Arabist thought in their region. They also have a problem with radical Islamic groups. They've seemingly enabled themselves to pit those two groups against each other.
Okay.
Many people will
If I could just ask you a question, what would Zionists actually have to gain from ISIS destroying the Arab world? What is the first main aim they would gain?
Well, obviously, if Israel's adversaries are all quarreling amongst themselves, then Israel can enjoy hegemony in the region and longevity and power in the region. And
it already enjoyed hegemony, did it not?
Well, the Syrian government wasn't entirely quiescent to Zionist hegemony. The Islamic Republic of Iran is not submissive to Israel. The people of the south of Lebanon are not submissive to Israel. So yes, they have certain quisling regimes and have sort of created a status quo in the region where they can operate. But their ideal scenario, a la Odegianon, is to reduce the Middle East to ethno-religious statelets. So the people of the Middle East will be perennially quarreling amongst themselves, and then Israel won't have any threat from a kind of unified, strong, modernized military actually genuinely posing a threat to them. So there's the question of how this manifests itself in the region, and there's the question of how this manifests itself in the West. And personally, as a Westerner, I'm noticing that whenever we have these alleged foiled terror plots, a good example just now, there's a case going through the courts here in Canada where it turns out that this homeless drug addict who was set up as apparently going to do a terrorist attack in Canada's westernmost province of British Columbia was taken away to a hotel for a holiday weekend by Canada's intelligence agency intelligence agents, and they were saying, "Oh, have you thought about using a pressure cooker? How are you going to do this?" And they were egging him on. And then suddenly the same, CSIS agency comes on our television screens and says, "Oh, we need, this legislation which will stop people, having freedom of speech and so on." So, the question is, what is this ISIS phenomenon? What is this terrorist phenomenon? And I think ever since
on that note, I think we've run out of time. But Joshua Blakeney there, a geopolitical analyst, joined us from Calgary, Canada. Please stay with us as we move on to the next section. Whilst it implements its religious extremism on areas it controls, ISIS is also erasing history and culture in Syria and Iraq. It oversaw the destruction of the ancient city of Nimrud in northern Iraq as part of a systematic campaign to destroy archaeological sites it says promote heresy. Some of the world's most precious cultural treasures, including ancient sites in the cradle of civilization, are in areas controlled by the group and at the mercy of extremists, hell-bent on wiping out all non-Islamic culture and history. The rampage, targeting priceless cultural artifacts, often spanning thousands of years, has sparked global outrage and accusations of war crimes. The militants are also believed to be selling ancient artifacts on the black market in order to finance their bloody campaign across the region. The destruction they have wreaked adds to the wider extensive damage done to ancient sites, including Palmyra, as well as mosques and churches all across the country, utilising the chaos of the Syria conflict. Mujtaba, ISIS is erasing the history of the Middle East. What is being done to stop them?
Well, unfortunately, all we get is UNESCO comments condemning it. ISIS, unfortunately, have attacked certain places in Iraq and in Syria in what they call as heresy, based on the ideological view. So what they do is they destroy these statues, they destroy these cultural heritage sites in the name of what they believe in. There are reports that some of these are replicas, and what they're doing is selling the real statues in the black market. So there is a bit of a confusing element to this, but what we do know is that they are destroying heritage sites, and that just shows the brutality of what we're dealing here. They're trying to wipe out history, wipe out any historical sites which have been there for thousands of years in the name of what they believe in.
Now, a string of major archaeological sites is now under their control. How concerning is this?
Well, unfortunately, there's not much that's been done about it. ISIS in Namrud have destroyed the Assyrian site, shrines of Shia Muslims, church Christians, synagogues. Every single site that comes in their position or in their power, they seem to be able to destroy, and nothing is done. What's hurting the most is the Syrian people, is the Iraqi people. They know how much that means to their country. They know how much that means to their culture, to their history. And unfortunately, the concern is seen by the Iraqi and Syrian people, but not by anyone else.
What actually drives this bankrupt ideology? Because we've seen images of destruction of alcohol, destruction of cigarettes, of stoning women, of executing people for being homosexual. I mean, what actually drives this ideology to commit all of these atrocities? Unfortunately,
this ignorance. We know that ISIS is an ignorant group which has inherited these beliefs from an ideology, from regional neighbors. We know this ideology is present in Nigeria. We know this ideology is present in Saudi Arabia. And unfortunately, these are committed based on religious beliefs. Now, this religious belief promotes this sort of takfiri ideology, and destroying cultural sites links to what it calls as polytheism, and therefore in terms of worshipping idols and this sort of ignorance that they believe in. And for that reason, they've decided to destroy these sites. I think there's more to it. I think they do want to rewrite history. They want to destroy everything which has any sort of cultural context. But we do know this ideology is inherited not far, and that's Saudi Arabia.
Now, are these actions actually Islamic?
I think every single Muslim organization has come out condemning it. They are un-Islamic acts. They are born and bred by this, culture of death. We have seen this element of extremism even before the Syrian war. And it's unfortunate that some people blame a government on how a group like ISIS is to rise.
I mean, how does this reflect on British Muslims? Because we have this concept of Orientalism as a political thought, and then in response to that, you have this post-structuralist ideology. But with the rise of ISIS, I mean, how has that made life for British Muslims and Arabs after 9/11 especially? What difference has that added to British Muslims?
Unfortunately, I mean, you have to admit, generalization is a disease in any form. But we do have anti-Islamophobes, bigots, who will generalize. And we've seen attacks on mosques. We've seen attacks on Muslim women. We've seen attack on Arabs and Muslims in general. And this has come as a result of the actions from ISIS. So no matter how much Muslims condemn it, there are bigots that will generalize. And we've seen these anti-Islamic protests by groups like Britain First in the UK, or by groups like the former group EDL. And unfortunately, we've seen groups and right-wing groups in government actually rise up because of this Islamophobe feeling.
Now, if we were to use Iraq as an example, Iraq was a secular state under the Baathists, as is Syria now under the Assad-led government. I mean, is the only alternative to secularism sectarianism, or is there a different alternative where you can have a pluralistic secularism present for a country in its political system?
If you're looking at Iraq and if you're looking at Syria, I mean, religious freedom was practiced in Syria. Christians were able to live freely. Even Yazidis were able to live freely in Syria. One of the only countries that were able to protect Yazidis in the Middle East. So in that secular society in Syria, there was this essence of religious freedom that was working. In Iraq, we have an ethno-sectarian issue, a geopolitical issue. You have the Kurds in northern Iraq who do want their own country. We have the Sunni Arabs and some pan-Arab nationalism there. And we have the Shia Muslims in the south. And that demographic makes it very difficult as to what can work. The narrative presented by the West right now is that there's a sectarian issue. And this seems to be the rhetoric that we hear from everywhere. But we have seen that the Syrian army is composed of mostly Sunni Muslims that are fighting. And also in Iraq, where Shia paramilitary forces have joined up with Sunni groups and tribes to fight. To fight the ISIS.
I mean, is this what's needed? The onus kind of has to be on the actual Muslims of the Middle East and of the greater Arab world to actually unify against these jihadi groups as a way of preserving the sovereignty of the Arab world. Would you agree with that?
Without a doubt, but are we seeing that in practical terms? In realistic terms, we have to look at the geopolitical issue. For example, the fear of the influence of Iran by some Arab countries, and therefore they will push this sectarian narrative. The fear of, for example, South Lebanon. And we've seen, for example, countries like Israel unite with groups like Al-Qaeda in Syria because of the fear of Hezbollah and Iran. And they've been able to create this narrative that Iran and Syria are some sort of, equating them to ISIS. And for this, the Arabs have not been able to see the true unity that they could promote, and which is why we see ISIS still controlling certain regions. If the Arabs wanted to remove ISIS, they would be able to help that, not artificially, realistically, on practical terms. But we have not seen that develop at the moment.
From a cultural aspect, how can the Arabs rewrite their history, or their modern history anyway?
I think the Arabs, to be frank and to speak realistically, even before Israel, there was a sense of infighting within Arabs. And so the history has seen sectarianism. The history has seen a sense of fighting within these Arab nations. And there needs to be a way of looking at how these Arabs can unite. And it needs to be done based on religion, it needs to be done based on humanity, based on social cohesion. There still remains this geopolitical issue. the influence from the West, the influence from countries like Israel, which have been able to infiltrate these Arab countries. And we haven't been able to see any sort of unity. We haven't seen any sort of practical steps to present a united group. And there are certain elements, for example, like Turkey, like Egypt, like Qatar, who still have issues amongst themselves because of the groups like the Muslim Brotherhood.
How close is ISIS to some regional states?
Well, how close ISIS is, and we know from Libya and from recently the Ethiopians that were killed, that they are not far from Europe itself. So we already know that these sleeper cells exist in most countries in the Middle East region and in Europe. We've seen the social media network, how strong their social media and their intelligence works online. So we need to understand that this threat is real. It's threat as a regional threat and also as a global threat. And we need to somehow come united on a practical level to defeat this. There has been this anti-ISIS coalition, which surprisingly has groups that were funding rebel groups in Syria that eventually turned to ISIS. So I'm not sure how practical these groups actually are in fighting ISIS or realizing the threat. I think they have realized the threat, but sometimes it's a bit too late.
Now, such regional states have been accused of supporting ISIS, ranging from Qatar to Saudi Arabia. How close are these countries, ideologically speaking?
Well, ideologically, we know that Saudi Arabia is the closest. In fact, we know that they've admitted that the highest number of foreign fighters in Syria are from neighboring countries like Jordan, like Saudi, or even North Africa and Tunisia. It's not just in Syria, and the Syrian president did warn about this, that it will come back to those who are funding it. So we've seen this develop in other countries like Afghanistan for now, or Pakistan, or countries like Libya and Nigeria. So this isn't contextualized just to Syria. So the ideology exists and it's spreading. We're starting to see it develop even in Europe. It comes from as we know, when the Jordanian pilot was burnt alive. They referenced a Muslim scholar by the name of Ibn Taymiyyah to justify the killing. So they have linked it to an ideology or a theological concept, and it links all the way back to Saudi Arabia. And this has been finally admitted by the West. They understand that these Salafi jihadist groups were inherited or breeded in Saudi Arabia.
Yes, and for our viewers to know, Ibn Taymiyyah was a scholar dating back to the medieval times, at the very least. But if we were to take recent events in Syria and Iraq, such as the destruction of the Assyrian city of Nimrud, how would that make you feel, especially as someone from that particular region? Yeah. I mean, isn't it shocking to see ISIS destroying history which is so associated with Syria and which is so associated with Iraq that it makes the center of these two countries, it actually makes them as important as they are, geographically speaking. I mean, how do you feel when you see such history destroyed in such a barbaric and brutal way by a group with a bankrupt ideology?
I mean, it's devastating, and the worst thing of it all is that nothing's done. And when we look at the cultural sites that have been destroyed and the shrines that have been destroyed, the only people that have truly suffered are the people of Syria and the people of Iraq, because they understand how much that means. The Assyrians are a small minority in Iraq, and unfortunately have been attacked by this ISIS group. And if the West speaks of human rights, speaks of standing up for justice and tolerance and so on, to turn a blind eye to these minorities shows the true nature of geopolitics and political affairs, and how much it stands in the way of justice, of truth, of standing up to oppression, oppression. And unfortunately, these sites are continuing to be destroyed. And these minorities, like the Yazidis, like the Christians, like the Assyrians, are continuing to be oppressed.
Just one last
Nothing's
question
done.
regarding this matter. I mean, we have the British History Museum, the Louvre in Paris. I mean, there have been lots of arguments for the fact that Arabic artifacts and historical objects of such a huge significance, they would be better off in Western museums than actually being present in the Arab world as we speak. What do you have to say to that?
I think that will be very difficult to implement on a practical level. The Arabs, I don't think, will allow it. The governments will find that difficult to move these sites to Europe, and there is that sense of trust already that's already lurking in between Arabs and between Muslims and the West. It's an idea, and I don't know if it's something that could be implemented. But I think at the moment it's very difficult to practically be able to move these heritage objects to the West.
Thank you very much. That's all we have time for. Mujtaba Ali Masood, research analyst and documentary producer, thank you so much for being on the show. And thank you very much to all of my other guests, Max Abrams, terrorism expert, Joshua Blakeney, geopolitical analyst. Thank you all for being on the show today. For more updates, please visit levant.tv. Thanks for watching Syria Talks. Till next time.